My son was rushed to the emergency room, so I texted my mom asking for help. She replied, "We're busy with Margaret." Then she mocked my son's condition. I quietly stopped paying every bill I'd been covering for them, and they finally realized how much they had taken me for granted. Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Collins. I'm 35 years old, and the day I finally stopped holding my family together began in the back of an ambulance. My 7-year-old son, Ethan, lay on the stretcher beside me. His tiny hand gripped mine so tightly, his knuckles had turned white. "Mom," his voice trembled. "Am I going to be okay?" I forced myself to smile. "Of course you are, sweetheart." Inside, I was terrified. The paramedic kept checking his oxygen level. Another adjusted the IV. Everything happened so quickly that I barely remembered grabbing my phone. I sent one text. "Mom, Ethan is being rushed to the emergency room. Can you please come?" For nearly 5 minutes, there was no reply. Then my phone buzzed. I smiled, thinking my parents were already on their way. Instead, I read 4 words that changed everything. "We're with Margaret." I stared at the screen, then typed back, "It's an emergency." A minute later, another message appeared. "Margaret needs us today." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Mom, I'm scared." Her final reply came almost instantly. "Children get sick. Stop panicking. Ethan has always been too dramatic anyway." I slowly locked my phone, then turned all my attention back to my little boy. 3 weeks later, my parents called in complete panic because their mortgage payment had bounced. Their car loan hadn't been paid. Their insurance had lapsed. And suddenly, they wanted to know what had happened. Looking back, the answer had been years in the making. I was 26 when Ethan was born. His father left before his first birthday. There were no dramatic custody battles, no long courtroom arguments. He simply disappeared. For a while, it was just Ethan and me. I worked as a payroll manager for a manufacturing company. The pay wasn't extraordinary, but it was stable. Every promotion, every bonus, every raise went toward building a secure life for my son. Meanwhile, my younger sister, Margaret, never seemed to stay in one place. 1 month, she'd start a boutique. The next, a photography business, then an online clothing store. Every new idea came with excitement. And eventually, debt. Mom and Dad rescued her every single time. Eventually, they ran out of savings. Without telling anyone, they refinanced their house twice. When I found out, Dad looked embarrassed. "We just wanted to help her." I quietly answered, "I know, but someone has to protect your future too." That's when I started helping, not because they demanded it, because I couldn't watch them lose everything. At first, it was small things: the electric bill, the internet, a prescription refill. Then, the mortgage payment. Dad promised, "Only until we're back on our feet." That was 4 years earlier. Without anyone really noticing, I became responsible for almost everything: mortgage, car payment, home insurance, internet, occasional groceries. Every payment came directly from my checking account. Whenever I offered to help Margaret organize her finances, she laughed. "You worry too much." Mom always defended her. "She's creative. She'll figure it out." Meanwhile, nobody asked how I managed everything, because I always did. Every Sunday, Mom called, usually not to ask about Ethan, but to ask about another bill. "Can you cover the insurance this month? The car payment is due. The mortgage comes out Tuesday." I never complained. I simply made sure it happened. Still, one thing always hurt. Whenever Ethan had a school play, a birthday, a soccer game, Mom usually had another excuse. "Margaret needs me." Dad rarely came without Mom. Eventually, Ethan stopped asking if Grandma would be there. That broke my heart more than anything. One Friday afternoon, everything changed. Ethan came home from school unusually quiet. He complained that his stomach hurt. I thought it might be a virus. Within an hour, he developed a high fever, then severe pain. He doubled over on the living room floor. I immediately called emergency services. The paramedics arrived within minutes. As they loaded him into the ambulance, I grabbed my phone. There was only one person I wanted: my mom. Not because I needed childcare, not because I wanted money, because I was scared. Her reply, "We're with Margaret." When I begged again, she answered, "Children get sick. Stop panicking. Ethan has always been too dramatic anyway." I read the message 3 times, then quietly placed my phone face down. I never answered again. The doctors worked quickly. Several terrifying hours later, they finally came into the waiting room. One smiled gently. "He's going to be okay." My knees almost gave out. It wasn't life-threatening, but he needed emergency surgery to prevent serious complications. I sat beside Ethan's hospital bed all night, holding his hand, listening to the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. Around midnight, he opened his eyes. "Grandma coming." I forced another smile. No, sweetheart. She's busy. He nodded sleepily. That's okay. I've got you. Those 4 words nearly broke me, because no 7-year-old should already understand disappointment that well. The following week, Ethan came home. Slowly, he recovered. Every evening, I'd sit beside his bed, reading adventure stories, until he fell asleep. One night, he looked at me and quietly asked, "Mom, why doesn't Grandma like me?" I couldn't answer. Not honestly. Instead, I kissed his forehead. "She loves you." The words tasted like a lie. After Ethan fully recovered, I opened my laptop, logged into every account connected to my parents. Mortgage, car loan, insurance, utilities I'd been covering. One by one, I removed my payment information, canceled every automatic transfer. Not out of revenge, simply because I finally understood something. If my son wasn't important enough to deserve compassion during an emergency, then my sacrifices weren't being appreciated. They were being expected. 3 weeks passed. Life became peaceful again. Then, at exactly 8:03 on a Monday morning, my phone rang. "Dad," I answered. Before I could say hello, he shouted, "Sarah!" The mortgage payment bounced. Our car loan wasn't paid. The insurance company says we're behind. What happened? I quietly looked toward Ethan, peacefully coloring at the kitchen table, then calmly replied, "I've been busy." There was a long pause. I finished softly. "Chat with Ethan. Sometimes, people only notice your sacrifices after they've disappeared." As my father sat in stunned silence on the other end of the phone, I realized the bills I had stopped paying weren't the real lesson. The real lesson was finally understanding the difference between being loved and merely being relied upon. Dad fell silent. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he whispered, "What do you mean?" "You're busy with Ethan." I looked across the room. Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, his coloring book spread open. His smile had finally returned. The sight reminded me why I had made my decision. I answered calmly, the same thing Mom told me when I asked for help. Dad's breathing grew heavier. "Sarah, please don't do this." "I didn't." "You did." Silence. Then he quietly asked, "Did you stop the payments?" "Yes." I removed my bank account from every bill I was paying. "You can't just..." I interrupted gently. "I can. They were my voluntary payments. You and Mom are responsible for your own mortgage, for your own car, for your own insurance." Another long silence. Then, "I didn't know." "I know. That's the problem." An hour later, Dad called again. His voice sounded completely defeated. "Can we come over?" I hesitated, then answered, "You can. But Ethan comes first." "We understand." That afternoon, Dad arrived with Mom. For the first time in years, neither of them walked into my house without knocking. I opened the door. Mom looked exhausted. She wasn't angry. She looked frightened. "We've had the worst 3 weeks." I nodded. So did Ethan. She lowered her eyes. Dad carefully placed a stack of envelopes on my dining table. Mortgage notices, insurance reminders, late payment letters. "I honestly didn't know you were paying this much." I quietly replied, "Because nobody ever asked." Mom looked confused. "We thought you were just helping occasionally." I walked to my desk, opened a folder. Inside was a spreadsheet I'd maintained for nearly 4 years. Every payment, every date, every confirmation number, mortgage, car loan, home insurance, internet, property taxes, even prescription costs Dad's insurance didn't cover. Dad slowly flipped through the pages. His hands started shaking. "You've paid almost $90,000. I nodded. "Over 4 years." Mom covered her mouth. "I never realized." "No, you were too busy helping Margaret." Those words hit harder than I intended. Mom sat down, then quietly asked, "Where is she?" I looked surprised. "You don't know?" She frowned. "No, I haven't seen her all morning." At that moment, Dad's phone rang. It was Margaret. He answered immediately. "Margaret?" We could hear her voice through the speaker. "Dad, my landlord's raising the rent again. I need help." Dad closed his eyes. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, something changed. "I can't." She sounded shocked. "What do you mean you can't?" "Sarah has been paying our bills." Silence. Then Margaret laughed. "What?" Dad continued. "For years. And because of us." She finally stopped. Another silence. Margaret quietly replied, "I didn't know." I finally spoke. "You never asked." No one argued. Because it was true. Over the next week, Dad met with the bank. They refinanced responsibly, created a realistic budget, canceled unnecessary subscriptions, sold a second vehicle they rarely used. For the first time in decades, he personally reviewed every monthly expense. Mom began working extra hours at the community bookstore, where she volunteered, not because anyone forced her, because she wanted to contribute. One evening, she asked if she could visit Ethan, just to apologize. I agreed. She walked into his room, carrying a small dinosaur puzzle. She sat beside him. "Hi, buddy." Ethan smiled politely. "Hi, Grandma." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you were in the hospital." He looked down at the puzzle. "I thought you didn't like me." Those words shattered her. She immediately hugged him. "I was wrong. So very wrong. I'm so sorry." Ethan quietly hugged her back. Children have remarkable hearts, sometimes far kinder than adults deserve. A few days later, Margaret came to my house. She looked embarrassed. "I owe you an apology." I waited. I spent years accepting Mom and Dad's help. I never stopped to ask where it was coming from. She shook her head. "I should have." I nodded. "Yes, you should have." She looked around my modest home, then quietly said, "I always thought you had everything under control." I smiled sadly. I did, until nobody cared whether my son was okay. Her eyes filled with tears. I deserve that. I didn't answer, because some truths don't need a response. Epilogue. 3 years have passed. Ethan is 10 now, healthy, happy, and obsessed with baseball. Dad never misses one of his games. Not one. Mom sits beside him in the front row. Every time, she still says that missing the hospital was the biggest mistake of her life. Not because I reminded her, because she reminds herself. Margaret rebuilt her life too. She found steady work, stopped relying on everyone else to rescue her. The biggest change wasn't financial, it was emotional. She finally learned that being loved doesn't mean expecting endless sacrifices from other people. As for me, I never paid another one of my parents' bills. Instead, I taught them how to manage everything themselves. The funny thing is, our relationship became stronger after I stopped rescuing them, because now it was built on appreciation, not dependence. My thoughts. Looking back, the moment that changed my life wasn't when my mother refused to come to the hospital. It was when my son quietly asked, "Why doesn't Grandma like me?" That question forced me to see what I'd been ignoring for years. Love isn't measured by how much you give. It's measured by how people treat you when you need them most. Helping family is a beautiful thing, but help should always be a gift, never an obligation. And if someone repeatedly overlooks your kindness while dismissing your pain, sometimes the healthiest decision isn't giving them one more chance. It's choosing the people who already choose you, starting with your own children.